Hello from Adelaide. I'm Mark Worthing, and among other things I teach poetry at Tabor, Adelaide, and as many of you with a keen interest in poetry, it's always exciting, fun to play with words to see how we can express the most difficult and complex thoughts in the best language possible, but also frustrating to see the low ebb, it seems, of poetry in popular culture today. This was brought home to me 5 or 6 years ago when I attended a conference in Tehran on another subject matter and took a trip to the local book fair, annual book fair, and found tent after tent, acre upon acre of books on poetry. It was hard to find anything but poetry. Later in my tour of Iran, we found places where in the evenings people would gather in the parks, not just by the hundreds, but sometimes the thousands, to hear readings of both contemporary and classical Farsi poetry. I came home feeling a little bit distressed, to say the least, that poetry and the poetic art in the English-speaking world had nowhere that kind of popularity. But then I realized that people do read poetry. Poetry does have a fair market, just not the kind of poetry that perhaps you or I would like to write about, to study, or to read. A little bit of thought and search found that the most popular selling poet in the English language in the last century is Helen Steiner Rice. And the most popular publisher and successful publisher of poetry is Hallmark, not just in their cards, but various collections of books and others. And of course, one thing that most of these have in common is that they're rhymed, they're metered, the thoughts are simple, they're predictable, the rhymes, the structure's predictable, the sentiment's predictable. Actually, I boast probably one of the most thorough collections of anyone I know of Helen Steiner Rice poetry, largely because in my poetry classes I always use here an example of how not to do rhyme poetry. I read a poem from Helen Steiner Rice. I stop before the end of every second line with a basic AABBCC rhyme pattern, and the students yell out spontaneously what the rhyming word is. Then I pick a poem by another author who's more of a nuanced poet, should we say, and read their poem using the same kind of meter, the same kind of structure. Usually W.H. Auden The Walking Tour is one of the favorites to use for this exercise, and no one can guess the words. The difference is going for the unexpected, the unusual, rather than the sentences that almost complete themselves. I have to admit I've had to dig out my Helen Steiner Rice books for this talk on popular poetry, because when I think of pop culture and poetry, my mind goes right to the Hallmark cards and the difficulty trying to find a card that's blank, for goodness sake, for fear that someone will think that I actually chose the card because of the poetic sentiments expressed in it. And of course, all the books that students buy me as a joke, I just added them to my shelf from Helen Steiner Rice. But I've recently hidden them and moved them because someone came to my office the other day. I thought they were well hidden, was looking down at the bottom of the shelf and said, "Oh, Dr. Worthing, I see you're also a fan of Helen Steiner Rice. Isn't she a wonderful poet?" Well, what do you say to that? You don't want to distress someone by saying what you really think, nor do I quite want to enter into a long discussion of the poetic wonders of Helen Steiner Rice. I just picked up this one at random from a book a student gave me. "Prayers are the stairs to God," to illustrate my point. "Prayers are the stairs we must climb every day. If we would reach God, there is no other way. For we learn to know God when we meet Him in prayer and ask Him to lighten our burden with care. So start in the morning, and though the way steep, climb ever upward till your eyes close in sleep. For prayers are the stairs that lead to the Lord, and to meet Him in prayer is the climber's reward." Now, if you happen to be a Christian, I happen to be a Christian myself, nothing really wrong with the theology of that, the sentiment, but there's so many better ways, I tell my students, to express your thoughts, your passions, your feelings, than to be so predictable, so obvious. In fact, probably what fascinates me most when I began thinking about the topic of pop culture and poetry is not so much why this kind of poetry is not good, why Helen Steiner Rice is the most successful published poet in the last 100 years, yet her poems never occur in any sophisticated anthologies. People don't write literary analyses of them unless they're tongue-in-cheek. But the gulf between what we as modern poets tend to do, what we recognize through our literary journals, our small collections, our publications, our classes as being good poetry, and what most people actually expect and think of and like when they see poetry. It's that gulf, that gap, that intrigues me the most, and that's what I'd like to spend some time researching, and happy to get feedback and ideas on looking at some of the reasons for this. Why is it that people like the predictable, the obvious, the poem that you only need to read once to get, that doesn't make you think, or that has only pleasant thoughts? And book after book of Helen Steiner Rice poetry comes up all the same thing. You look in vain for something that deals with an issue that leaves you troubled or thinking there's any complexity or there's not a simple basic answer. And I suppose the same with the Hallmark cards and the Hallmark collection of poetry. It's not the kind of place you raise questions about war and peace and ethics and justice in the world and the difficult nuances of love and hate and relationships. It's where everything rhymes, everything's sunny, everything's happy. Perhaps in our poetry, are we too obscure? Are we not sunny enough? Or have we simply stopped teaching people how to appreciate good poetry? And the only thing that is accessible is that which, in essence, is a caricature of the poetry of centuries past. The easy, rhymed, metered, predictable language, full of cliche, full of the obvious, full of nothing but good feelings that could hardly offend anyone unless they were looking at it from a literary point of view. So poetry and pop culture, my topic, my interest is Hallmark poetry and Helen Steiner Rice. And why is it that at a time when poetry seems to be so little appreciated and so little read in our own history of English speakers, at least good poetry, why is it that this kind of poetry remains so popular, so visible, so irrepressible? What's the attraction? What's the appeal? Have we poets taken a wrong turn, or have we simply stopped teaching people what to look for in poetry? Are the masses always right? Should we begin changing to adapt our style, our form, to what sells rather than what we think we should write? I think very few would say that. How do you begin to teach people who read a poem from a Hallmark card and ooze over it and send it via the email to all their friends that this isn't really good poetry? How do you begin to show them how to appreciate something that may not be rhymed, that may not be metered, that may not be easy to figure out, that may have more than one meaning or no clear meaning at all? These are some of the questions I'd like to reflect on a bit further. I'm just at very early stages in thinking about it, but it's fascinated me for some time. And it seems like an odd thing to look at academically with this kind of poetry. Certainly not the structure of it, certainly not trying to piece together how to do it, but to understand something about why the gulf between this and what's accepted among literary people is good poetry, and why that gulf exists within popular culture, I think, is certainly an area worthy of investigation. Thanks for taking the time to listen to my preliminary thoughts as I just begin to look into this question.